The governor signs a bill legalizing marijuana while the U.S. Supreme Court proves reluctant to stop gerrymandering. What will it mean for Illinois? We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state politics and government and what it might just mean for you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Hannah Meisel of the Daily Line. Welcome, Hannah.
Glad to be here.
And also Adrianna Pitrelli of the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Welcome, Adrianna.
Thanks for having me.
Sorry for stumbling so much. Looking forward
fine.
to. Okay.
Excited.
Hey, big news this week. Not necessarily a surprise. Governor Jb Pritzker signs a bill legalizing recreational marijuana in the state of Illinois. They look like veritable leprechauns up there on the stage. The governor in his green tie, all sorts of green accoutrements, smiles all around. Hannah, you've looked at this issue quite a bit. It involves more than just legalizing marijuana and business and dollars and cents. It also involves questions of criminal justice. What can you tell us about that?
Right. The sponsors and the governor, they were all very clear from the beginning, on the campaign trail. And gosh, in the years leading up to this, the sponsors had been working behind the scenes. And they all say that, the point of legalizing and regulating marijuana in the state is not just for tax revenue. It's really to hit the reset button on the war on drugs. I feel like they use that exact phrase at the bill signing Tuesday. The war on drugs has disproportionately affected Black and brown communities, unequal policing of very minor drug crimes, and a lot of them having to do with marijuana. Which is equally consumed among white folks, Black folks, Latino folks. And so, but again, the policing and the community destruction has really, fell on the shoulders of Black and brown communities. And so baked into this bill is a lot about, making sure that people from those communities get a chance to become part of the industries should they choose to, and be able to profit from that. But then there's this big piece on expungements and pardons. And so, that is a huge thing. People from, criminal justice researchers, they say that's going to mean a lot for these folks and these families, these communities. It's a relatively lengthy process, or not a lengthy process, but it's a lot to chew on, so we can talk about that later.
Thousands of people we're talking about.
It's something like 700,000 convictions and arrest records belonging to something like 315,000 people. So that's major.
Yeah. I mean, how do you just take an eraser, forget about it, all goes away? I mean, because we're talking, I think, two things here. We're talking about up to 30 grams of marijuana, which is an ounce, essentially 28 grams being an ounce, and then at 30 grams, and that had been dropped, I believe, from the legislation as it finally passed. That was what the debate was over. Going up to, I believe it was 500 grams. Is that giving too much of a break? What are we going to do? What's going to happen to the folks? The misdemeanor ones, I think, folks are fairly well agreed on, that if it's, I believe, less than an ounce, I'm trying to remember what the misdemeanor threshold is, that's okay. But there's this in between where we have, a fairly substantive amount of marijuana, but not quite Pablo Escobar. How do we deal with that?
So for folks who were arrested, but it never led to a conviction, and up to 30, they're possessing or had intent to deliver up to 30 grams of marijuana, which I looked up, and it's like this much. I don't know. I'm really terrible at explaining this, but maybe 10 little pods. Okay. I'm really not hip to the lingo.
Okay. Yeah.
But so the Illinois State Police, along with local law enforcement, they will basically scrub their database, and they'll come up with a list of folks who they believe are eligible for just full-on expungement.
Automatic, so to speak? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Of course, there's going to be, going through and checking to make sure that, they didn't sweep up any records by mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's deadlines to expunge those based on how old the arrest records are, because you have to remember, I mean, digitization is relatively new, and also in state and local governments, digitization is way slower than the rest of the general population. Sure. So that's the first group. And then those who were convicted, they were arrested, and then it did indeed lead to a conviction up to 30 grams. So their process is a bit longer. So in the next 6 months, basically, the Illinois State Police will identify all eligible convictions of that sort. They will take those to the Prisoner Review Board. Prisoner Review Board will, basically go in, make sure that, again, none of those were put in by mistake. State's attorneys have a chance to, make sure that those are not mistakes. Yeah. And then from there, so it's quite a long process. Not lengthy, but just steps. They assure reporters that it's not going to be overly lengthy. So from there, PRB takes it to the governor. The governor does like a mass pardon. Your pardon, everyone gets a pardon. From there, Attorney General.
Do you get a certificate that you can frame? Or?
I wanted to ask about that. I'm not really sure. I feel like no, but possibly.
Well, I think they would be worth something. You could sell them on eBay, maybe something. I was pardoned for, but go ahead.
We'll check. All right. So from there, Attorney General will go to each individual circuit court in the state and will, petition for the expungement of those records. Got that? Okay. Now.
Well, it's the Attorney General. I mean, so far it sounds fairly, I don't want to use the term rote, but who's going to object in this process that you've just described?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's this third group of folks who were arrested, convicted, and they were carrying anywhere from 30 grams to 500 grams. I looked up 500 grams, and again, I'm not going to be good at explaining this, but it's, I don't know, like a piece of paper with a bunch of, imagine that size. Yeah. And so...
That's more than personal use for most folks. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know, but maybe I saw, some people discussing it, and they said, maybe it's mostly for your personal use, but you might sell it off. But you're not a big shark in a drug operation.
Oh, no, but you're talking, I think, close to a pound. But
sure. Yeah. All right, so for this group of folks, state's attorneys, they can, if they're so inclined, they can go to the courts and ask for, they will file what's called a motion to vacate convictions. And then I got curious during the press conference, what happens if there's a state's attorney, we saw last year a bunch of counties that kind of went rogue and said, we're sanctuary gun counties. Yeah. Now, guns, drugs, not the exact same ethos.
Although, not to interrupt, when the medical marijuana program first came about, there was a question whether FOID card holders could be. So go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt, but guns and marijuana are not unique questions.
True. It's, so, there are state's attorneys who are opposed and had been opposed throughout the process of legalizing marijuana writ large. And so if they do not want to go in and file this motion to vacate, then, I have the opportunity to do that for myself, or a legal aid organization will have the opportunity to do that. And then state's attorneys can then object.
So, I mean, it sets me up. I mean, nobody knows, of course, what's going to happen. It's way early in the process. But we have, 101 counties here in Illinois. 102, thank you, I stand corrected. That's a lot of possibilities, state's attorneys out there, for someone to say, you know what, I'm going to draw a line in the sand here, and I believe that marijuana is not good, is not healthy, and there are people who believe that, and they're good people who believe that. So, I mean, I'm wondering what the potential is for, like you say, these sanctuary gun counties, except for, I'm not sure whether there's a process ever set up in state law for sanctuary gun counties as there is with this one.
Sure.
So
yeah, I'm not sure. And I mean, any law that the legislature can ever pass has the opportunity to be challenged in court. I haven't heard any rumblings of a challenge, but it's not out of the question.
Yeah. The money side of it, I've always long been interested in this part of it. And you and I were talking, I think, prior to the taping of this program. This started out as $170 million is what the governor had initially said it is his draft budget, his first budget. That's what it's going to bring in terms of licensing fees alone for marijuana. It's substantial. It's going to be substantially less than that. It's going to be nowhere close to that. I ran some numbers my own and came up with something shy of $50 million. And that's the most optimistic scenario. I've seen another one that WGN had reported $57 million, I think, then that's been revised downward. I mean, draft budgets are drafts, but how could they have been so far away from what the true figure is? Because 170 million wasn't comporting with what other states' experiences had. A, why were they so far off? B, is that for any kind of cause for concern in terms of trying to figure out or projecting how much money we're actually going to get from marijuana sales?
Well, the governor was never married to that February budget, and arguably, you know, there's a whole legislative process that has to go on. So if you're too married to it, then that can cause problems. Read the last 4 years of the Rana era. Now, is it problematic? I mean, you really only have one chance to, you know, one chance at a first impression, so the saying goes. You know, with a big legislative gamble like this, also kind of a social gamble. I mean, there's a lot of elements here, so they want, you know, you want to make sure that it's totally right. It is, you know, maybe it is alarming that the estimate of the revenue went down so much. I wasn't, of course, privy to those conversations. Maybe they were basing it on a lot more licenses that the state was going to give out initially, and then they brought it down to 75. You know, is that going to be enough? The governor, you know, we asked the governor the other day, is that going to be enough? He said yes, and there's going to be, but you know, an examination of that later. But again, I mean, like, this is new territory. We are the first state to do this purely legislatively. So people are going to be watching us.
No, I think you're absolutely right. People are going to be watching us, and in terms of the social equity part of this equation, it is unprecedented. Other states have talked about it. New York, I think, notably, was going to try and do something along these lines. They couldn't get it done, and so you know, among other issues, this would seem to be an issue that's been pushed nationwide. We're the first to get it done. I'm wondering how much of a petri dish, for lack of a better word, this might be for Democrat. I mean, not necessarily all Democrat, but democratically controlled state governments nationwide. I mean, other people are looking at this.
Yeah, I mean, like Hannah said, we're the first state to do it this way. So, and as more states start to do it, they're definitely going to take into consideration what we're doing and the process, and almost, you know, they might take some stuff from us. They might also learn, okay, as we, you know, roll this out over the next 6 months or so, and even as the years go on, you know, other states are going to learn, okay, this didn't really work for Illinois, or this really worked for Illinois. And so I think for sure, I mean, even already just with the governor signing it, it's made headlines everywhere, and people are looking at it, so for sure. Yeah,
and I question also how hard and fast this is going to be. I mean, if we look at the example of medical marijuana, when that bill was rolled out, it was widely criticized, I think perhaps deservedly so, for how unwieldy it could be. I mean, I'd mentioned briefly that there had been a brief debate over, Jesus, if someone has a FOID card, should they also be able to have a medical marijuana card? That question was at one point being seriously asked here in Illinois. And then you had things like being fingerprinted for a medical marijuana card, and a very restrictive list of conditions, and the list of conditions also is restrictive, and not very many cards being issued in the early years, and even now I believe there's 50,000 or so that are out there. Not a great deal compared to what the need might be. I guess with that in mind, I think we can probably expect tweaks. If there's going to be tweaks to this, do you have any sense as to what might be changed? Are there things that are more out on a limb here than anything else than others here? Tax rates or licensing fees, or everything down from restrictions on advertising and packaging?
I think all of the above. I mean, the sponsors said, you know, the other day at the bill signing, and, you know, for the weeks in between passing the bill and this week, that they're nowhere near done. This is just, as one of the Senate negotiators, Troy Hutchinson, likes to say, a first bite at the apple. You know, she is very proud of that first bite of the apple, but, you know, so I think all of the above. I mean, you had mentioned the application fees for these licenses. I mean, I saw a lot of criticism that they're prohibitively high. And if you're saying that your goal is to make sure that people from disenfranchised communities that have been hit hardest by the drug war, that you want them to be very active in the marijuana industry, but then, you know, I think there's a non-refundable application fee of $5,000.
Correct.
Like
$30,000 if you're an existing business in medical marijuana and you want to do that. But yeah, you're right. It's and beyond that, that's the application fee. And then presuming you pass muster and there's a scoring system, presuming you get a license, then it can be potentially, you know, into the 5 or even 6 figures depending on what you want after that. I believe. And
then tax rates. You know, the governor's office provided a pretty helpful breakdown of where the revenues would go. Some of it is community reinvestment, some is education program, but 10% of it goes to pay the state's bill backlog, which currently stands at, last I checked, something like that, $7 billion, which you know, that's still, it's not where we were 2 years ago, but it's still a really big number, and it's still really you know, affecting state government processes and state government services, and so you know, they might want to tweak that later on. We will see. Oh yeah, I think, you know, because on the marijuana bud itself, that's the marijuana bud as opposed to the processed stuff, Hannah, because I know that it's smaller. That tax rate, I believe, would be 10%, which would be substantially lower than a lot of other states have had it. You know, I've asked myself the last couple of days, why would anybody want a medical marijuana card anymore if you can buy it recreationally? I mean, presumably you'd be able to save on taxes, but to me, one of the big advantages, I think, is you could grow marijuana. You would be allowed up to 5 plants. And if you've got a green thumb, that can be a substantial amount of marijuana. So it'll be interesting to me, at least. Will the number of medical marijuana cards stay the same? Will they go up? Will they go down? And there's still a charge for that, I believe $100 for 1 year for a medical marijuana card. Well, there's more than marijuana going on in Illinois, and thank goodness. We have had recently decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court where they have proven reticent to step into the redistricting process that occurs in states. And that's one of the best things about being in the majority every 10 years or so, is that you get to make the rules about the legislative districts. This could affect Illinois. There's been talk about an independent mapping process. And this is something that the governor has somewhat endorsed. It's not something that Mike Madigan would necessarily like. Is there going to be any kind of a showdown here in terms of Mr. Madigan and folks in his camp saying, you know, to the spoils go the winners, or to the winners go the spoils, sorry. We get to do this, versus an approach which I presume the Republicans would rather have, which is let's take the politics out of it. Is the governor in a box? I mean, I just listened back to some audio of the governor being interviewed by a St. Louis public radio reporter back like the week before the election. And, you know, JB, the candidate, said, you know, yes, I will veto any gerrymandered maps that are passed through the legislature, and yes, I will stand up to Mike Madigan. He used those exact words. But here's the thing, the definition of gerrymandering, especially because the Supreme Court today, we're filming on Thursday, you know, declined to really stick its neck out and define gerrymandering. It's so squishy because on the one hand, you know, you never want districts that are, people say that they don't want districts that are explicitly drawn so that one party gets an advantage. However, what do you do with folks, especially minority communities who tend to vote Democratic? What do you do with them? You know, you pack and crack. So pack all of the people in one district. So, you know, all of their, they would only be able to get one Democrat. I'm talking generally in Republican states, because a lot of these cases have come out of Republican states. Of course, we are in a blue state, so it's somewhat different. And then, or crack, you dilute their power by splitting people in one area or neighborhood into several districts.
And expose yourself potentially to voting rights.
Right. And so that's been one of the arguments all along in Illinois. It was like, well, we're not violating voting rights, so we're doing it correctly. Well, no, because, look at the districts in Chicago, look at the ones, downstate. Especially, you look at Champaign-Urbana, there are Democrats that come out of there, and if not for the concentration of the urban community downstate, those districts wouldn't necessarily be, Democratic.
Sure.
But so there's a lot to consider here. Has the governor painted himself into a corner? Not one that he can't get out of.
Well, I'm wondering, maybe the U.S. Supreme Court has. Who knows? I mean, and I think your point is well taken. It's almost like obscenity. Could you define obscenity? No, but I know it when I see it. And so, maybe this is a first impressions sort of thing. Because, I mean, we've all seen these maps. There's a peninsula that bloats out into a balloon, then turns left and turns, and it has a little dog tail, goes over there. And you look at those things, and how in the world could that ever, the congressman lives at the end of that dog tail or something like that. So there's explanations there. How much is Madigan going to fight, if at all, how important is this to him?
This is so central to this power.
Yeah.
So I don't think it would necessarily benefit him, but I mean, perhaps to have a public fight with the governor. I think a lot of fighting is going to go on behind closed doors. But they are kind of at odds. But again, I think the governor can get out of what Republicans are for sure going to call promises by perhaps coming up with an alternative plan that's that he could say, it's independent map making, but is still palatable to Democrats that Republicans are not going to like. But then they might have egg on their face by not voting with it.
Well, speaking of the speaker, one of his aides had a visit from some federal officials in recent months. The FBI raided Kevin Quinn's home. We've just found this out. Apparently, this search warrant was served some time ago. Does anybody know what this is about? I mean, because Quinn had been in the news. He did not leave his post from Madigan's office under particularly auspicious circumstances, is my understanding. What do you make of it, Adrianna?
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily know what information the agents were seeking to get, or whether the raid even stemmed from Quinn's past work with Madigan.
Because he was also involved with an alderman in Chicago, and there's been those. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, so apparently, but they were interested in his computers and his electronic equipment. He's not the first person close to Madigan who has, people have had eyes on recently, or, in the past in general. So it's interesting to kind of keep an eye on this. I mean, I think that people have been suspicious of Madigan for quite some time, and nothing's come of it yet.
Sure.
But the more and more you're hearing, and the more and more people that are close to him, I mean, this could have been about everything, but it does seem suspicious that more people close to Madigan are under watch.
Well, it's curious because, again, he has ties to 13th Ward alderman in Chicago. So you don't know, is this about state stuff? Is this about city stuff? Or is this about something completely different that we don't have any inkling of? There's got to be an affidavit in support of that search warrant. I'm wondering where that is, because that will lay out the government's case about why they got the search warrant. It's a federal matter, however, so those are sometimes harder to get a hold of than if they're filed in state court. This just came out yesterday or the day before?
Last night, and we're filming on Thursday.
So yeah.
I'm guessing that affidavit is sealed for now.
Correct.
But, in
Stranger
time,
things have happened.
Oh, yeah. I mean, think of the winter that we had with all of the Alderman Ed Burke stuff coming out. I mean, that was due to some luck and some timing and some good sourcing on the Sun-Times part. We wouldn't have known the half of, Alderman Danny Solis wearing a wire against Alderman Ed Burke. I mean, like, that stuff is wild, and all the salacious stuff that came with that.
Well,
and
you call it salacious, I call it, well, go ahead.
A Wednesday? Sorry.
But I mean, you're right. In that case, I mean, a lot of it came out just by a mistake, an error, where somebody who was supposed to seal it didn't seal it, and one of these court documents that did lay out a substantial amount of the government's case on some of these allegations against aldermen.
Yeah. Well, I'm guessing that we will find out eventually. Could be months, could be years. I mean, think of the federal case against the speaker himself that stemmed from the 2016 primary challenger. Yeah. We found out back in January, and the transcript of his deposition, the speaker's deposition, was unsealed and revealed to the press. Yeah. I can't remember how, but that's basically 3 years after the fact.
Correct. We're almost out of time, but we would be remiss if we didn't note that Admiral Jb Pritzker has had a run-in with the authorities in Wisconsin, boating in excess of the allowable speed. How much of a scandal is this? I mean, he was going 41 miles an hour, and it was on a Wisconsin lake. I mean, he couldn't be boating here in Illinois. Should we be worried?
I think we're okay.
Okay.
He wasn't drunk. He wasn't, he wasn't going 30 over.
Sure.
It was a boat.
I heard it was quite a boat. I heard it had a toilet on it. But with that, we're out of time. And so thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.